On September the 2nd, 1945, the thinnest man on the deck of the USS Missouri was standing directly behind Douglas MacArthur. 3 years earlier, MacArthur had cabled Washington that this man had become temporarily unbalanced. He had blocked this man's Medal of Honor. He had ordered this man to fight to the death, then left him behind to do it alone. Now MacArthur was handing him a pen. The man's name was Jonathan Wainwright. He was 62 years old and looked 80. His uniform hung off his frame like it belonged to someone twice his size. His hair had gone completely white. His cheekbones looked like they might cut through from the inside. He had spent 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps, surviving on rice and water, waiting for the day his own country would court-martial him for surrendering the largest American force in military history. That day never came. Instead, he was standing on the most photographed ship in the world, watching the empire that had imprisoned him sign away everything. This is the story of the general who was left behind, and what he did when no one was coming to save him. The Philippines had been an American territory for over 40 years by December 1941. Manila was the pearl of the Pacific, a city of wide boulevards, whitewashed government buildings, and officers' clubs, where men drank gin rickeys under ceiling fans and talked about polo matches. The U.S. Army's presence there felt permanent, almost lazy. War was something that happened to other people in other oceans. Jonathan Wainwright fit right into that world. He was 58 years old, a cavalry officer to his bones. Tall, 6'2", and so thin that he'd weighed only 125 pounds when he showed up at West Point in 1902. His classmates took one look at him and called him Skinny. The name stuck for life. He graduated in 1906 as first captain of the Corps of Cadets, the highest-ranking cadet in his class, and chose the cavalry because he loved horses more than he loved anything else except maybe whiskey and cigarettes. His father, Robert Wainwright, had been a cavalry officer too, fought in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, then got posted to the Philippines and died there of disease in 1902, the same year young Jonathan entered West Point. The Philippines had already taken something from the Wainwright family. It would take more. By 1941, Wainwright was a major general commanding the Philippine Division, a force of Filipino scouts led by American officers. He'd served in World War I as a staff officer with the 82nd Division in France, spent the interwar decades climbing through the peacetime ranks the slow way, and arrived back in Manila in late 1940 for what should have been a comfortable assignment. When the Japanese invaded, he was commanding the North Luzon Force, 3 reserve Filipino divisions, and the 26th Cavalry Regiment. His boss was Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was 61. He was also, depending on who you asked, either the most brilliant military mind of his generation or the most dangerous ego in uniform. Both descriptions were probably accurate. He'd graduated first in his class at West Point in 1903. He'd been the youngest division commander in France during World War I. He'd served as Army Chief of Staff from 1930 to 1935, the highest-ranking officer in the entire United States Army. Then he'd retired, moved to Manila, and become a military advisor to the Philippine government, which gave him the title of Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. No other American officer in history had ever held that rank in a foreign military. In July 1941, with war looking increasingly likely, Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active duty and put him in command of all U.S. Army forces in the Far East, the USAFFE. MacArthur had about 130,000 troops on paper, but most of them were undertrained Filipino reservists with old equipment and almost no combat experience. His real striking power was the Far East Air Force, the largest concentration of B-17 heavy bombers outside the continental United States. 35 flying fortresses sat on the tarmac at Clark Field, 65 miles north of Manila. If war came, those bombers were supposed to hit Japanese bases on Formosa and keep the enemy at arm's length long enough for reinforcements to arrive. That was the plan. December 7th, 1941, December 8th in the Philippines, on the other side of the international date line. News of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached Manila at approximately 3:40 in the morning, when MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Richard Sutherland, was woken by a commercial radio broadcast. What happened over the next 9 hours would become one of the most debated failures in American military history. Major General Louis Brereton, commanding the Far East Air Force, went to MacArthur's headquarters before dawn and requested permission to launch an immediate strike against Japanese airfields on Formosa. Sutherland told him to prepare for a mission, but wait for MacArthur's authorization. Brereton came back again around 10 in the morning and pressed harder. He warned Sutherland directly if Clark Field was hit before the bombers got airborne, the entire offensive capability of the Philippines would be destroyed on the ground. MacArthur's authorization finally came at 10:14 a.m. It was already too late. The Japanese had originally planned to strike at dawn, but heavy fog over Formosa delayed their takeoff by several hours. By a stroke of catastrophic timing, their attack force 26 G-3M bombers, 82 G-4M bombers, and 84 Zero fighters arrived over Clark Field at 12:35 in the afternoon. The American planes were lined up on the tarmac. Some had just landed to refuel. Others were being loaded with bombs for the mission that had been approved 2 hours earlier. The Japanese pilots later said they could barely believe what they saw. In 45 minutes, the Far East Air Force lost nearly half its planes. Clark Field was wrecked. The fighter base at Iba, 42 miles to the west, was hit almost simultaneously. By the end of the first day, American air power in the Philippines was effectively finished. 9 hours. That's how long the United States had between Pearl Harbor and the destruction of Clark Field. 9 hours of warning and the planes were still on the ground. Unlike Pearl Harbor, there was never an official investigation into what happened at Clark Field. No one was held accountable. MacArthur's explanation for the delay shifted over the years, and to this day, historians disagree about exactly why the bombers weren't launched at dawn. What isn't disputed is the result. The United States lost control of the sky over the Philippines on the first day of the war, and it never got it back. Without air cover, the rest unraveled fast. The Japanese landed at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd, with approximately 43,000 troops under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma. Homma was 54, a career officer who'd spent 8 years as a military attaché in Britain, served with the British Expeditionary Force in France in 1918, and received the British Military Cross for his service. Among the Japanese High Command, he was considered suspiciously Western in his sympathies, cultured moderate to soft. Tokyo sent him to the Philippines expecting a quick conquest. It would not be quick. MacArthur's plan to stop the Japanese on the beaches collapsed within 48 hours. The Filipino reserve divisions, undertrained and under-equipped, couldn't hold. MacArthur was forced to abandon his strategy and fall back on War Plan Orange 3, the old pre-war contingency that called for a withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, where American forces would hold out until the Navy could fight its way across the Pacific with reinforcements. The withdrawal to Bataan was one of the most difficult retreats of the entire war, and Wainwright was the man who made it work. His North Luzon force had to fight a series of delaying actions across hundreds of kilometers, holding bridges and mountain passes just long enough for the bulk of the army to funnel south onto the peninsula. The 26th Cavalry Regiment, the last horse cavalry regiment to see combat in American history, fought rearguard actions on horseback against Japanese tanks. Wainwright was at the front, constantly close enough to the fighting that his staff officers kept telling him he was going to get killed. He ignored them. The retreat succeeded. The army reached Bataan, but there was a problem that no amount of tactical skill could fix. The withdrawal had happened too fast, and the supply depots along the route hadn't been fully evacuated. Bataan was supposed to have enough food stockpiled for 6 months. It had enough for roughly one. 80,000 troops, American and Filipino, were now crowded onto a jungle peninsula with a fraction of the supplies they needed to survive. On the day after Christmas, MacArthur declared Manila an open city and moved his headquarters to Corregidor, a small tadpole-shaped island sitting in the mouth of Manila Bay. The island was about 3.5 miles long, barely a mile wide at its broadest point, and honeycombed with tunnels and fortified gun positions built over decades to guard the entrance to the bay. The centerpiece was Malinta Tunnel, a main east-west passage with dozens of lateral branches carved into the rock. Inside, the army had built a hospital, supply depots, command centers, a power plant, and living quarters. It was designed to withstand naval bombardment. No one had considered what it would be like to live inside it for months, under constant air and artillery attack. MacArthur set up his headquarters in one of Malinta's laterals. His wife John and their 4-year-old son Arthur were there with him. So were the senior staff, the nurses, the wounded, and several thousand civilians who had fled Manila. The tunnel was crowded, humid, and dark. It smelled like diesel exhaust and disinfectant and sweat. And from the beginning, everyone on Corregidor knew the same thing: help was supposed to be coming. It wasn't. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Navy didn't have the ships to break through the Japanese blockade around the Philippines. Submarines and a handful of aircraft made occasional supply runs, but they couldn't carry enough to make a difference. Washington told MacArthur that reinforcements were on the way. Marshall sent cables promising support. Some of those promises were sincere attempts to buy time. Others were lies, and the men who sent them knew they were lies. MacArthur passed those promises along to his troops. He told them help was coming. Ships, planes, fresh divisions. The men on Bataan believed him because they needed to believe something, and because Douglas MacArthur had a way of making you believe whatever he said. They wrote a song about it, sung to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The lyrics called him Dugout Doug, a general who hid in his tunnel on Corregidor while they starved in the jungle. But even the men who sang it still hoped he was right, that the convoy was real, that rescue was coming. It never came. On February 22, 1942, President Roosevelt sent MacArthur a direct order to leave the Philippines and proceed to Australia, where he would take command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. Roosevelt's reasoning was strategic and cold. MacArthur was too valuable to lose, too famous, too experienced, too important as a symbol. His capture or death would be a propaganda disaster. The Philippines were going to fall regardless. The question was whether MacArthur would fall with them. MacArthur didn't want to go. He told his staff he'd resign his commission and enlist as a volunteer on Bataan. He talked about dying with his men, but Roosevelt wasn't asking. On the night of March 11th, MacArthur, his wife, his son's Cantonese nursemaid, and a small group of staff officers, including Sutherland, climbed aboard 4 PT boats commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkley. The boats slipped out of Corregidor's harbor in the dark, running through seas patrolled by Japanese destroyers. They reached Mindanao 2 days later, then flew to Australia in a pair of B-17s. On March 20th, at a small railway station in Terowie, South Australia, MacArthur made his declaration to the press. "I came through," he said, "and I shall return." Washington asked him to change the wording to "we shall return." He refused. 5 days later, on March 25th, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall sent a secret memorandum to President Roosevelt recommending that MacArthur be awarded the Medal of Honor. Marshall's reasoning was blunt and pragmatic. The Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians were calling MacArthur a coward, a deserter, a fleeing general. The Medal of Honor would counteract enemy propaganda. Marshall wrote the citation himself and admitted privately that MacArthur hadn't performed a specific act of valor in the traditional sense, but argued that precedent existed for broader awards. Roosevelt approved it. On April 1, 1942, April Fool's Day, War Department General Order No. 16 officially announced that MacArthur had been awarded the Medal of Honor. The physical presentation came later on June 30th in Melbourne, where the American minister to Australia hung the medal around MacArthur's neck. But the announcement alone was enough. The message was clear: the general who left was a hero. The general who stayed was still starving. Wainwright had been promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all United States forces in the Philippines, the USFIP. But MacArthur, before leaving, had done something that would later become a trap. He had split the command structure, leaving Wainwright in charge of the Luzon forces and placing Brigadier General William Sharp in command of the Visayas Mindanao force in the south. MacArthur's logic was calculated. If Corregidor fell, the southern forces could keep fighting independently, denying the Japanese a clean sweep. Roosevelt and Marshall didn't know about this arrangement. They assumed Wainwright was in charge of everything. They promoted him accordingly. When MacArthur found out, he objected, but Washington overruled him. So Wainwright was now the senior commander in the Philippines, responsible for every American and Filipino soldier in the islands. He had no air force. He had no navy. He had a starving army on Bataan, an island fortress running out of ammunition, and a clear-eyed understanding that no one was coming to save any of them. On April 2, 1942, Wainwright wrote in his diary the entry that would define the rest of his life. "I'm going to stay in the Philippines and share the fate of my men on Corregidor. There's no other honorable course for me." His staff urged him to escape, to take a PT boat to Mindanao, then fly to Australia, the same route MacArthur had taken. He could continue the fight from safety. He could avoid capture. Wainwright refused. 2 days later, on April 4th, MacArthur cabled from Australia with an order. Under no conditions was Wainwright to surrender. If food ran out, he was to prepare and execute an attack against the Japanese. Wainwright read the cable. He looked at the numbers: 24,000 men on Bataan, too sick to fight, the rest surviving on 1,000 calories a day. Hundreds of new malaria cases reported every morning. Quinine nearly gone. He sent his reply. His troops, he told Washington, were so weak from malnutrition that they had no power of resistance. 5 days later, Bataan fell. On the morning of April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King sat in a makeshift command post on the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula and made a decision that no American general had made on this scale since the Civil War. King was 58 years old, an artilleryman from Georgia. Quiet and methodical. The kind of officer who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. He'd taken command of the Luzon force on Bataan after Wainwright moved to Corregidor. And for weeks he'd watched his army disintegrate, not from enemy action, but from biology. His men weren't soldiers anymore. They were patients. 78,000 of them crammed into a strip of jungle 25 miles long, eating anything they could find: monkeys, snakes, lizards. The cavalry horses that Wainwright's 26th Regiment had ridden in the retreat from Lingayen. 1,000 calories a day if they were lucky. Malaria burning through the ranks so fast that commanders were reporting hundreds of new cases every morning. Dysentery, beriberi, scurvy, men too weak to hold a rifle, let alone fire one. On April 3rd, the Japanese had renewed their offensive with fresh troops, heavy artillery tanks, and air support. The American and Filipino defenders, already hollowed out, had almost nothing left to stop them with. Ammunition was critically low. The front lines were collapsing. King did not call Wainwright. He knew what Wainwright would say, the same thing MacArthur had cabled from Australia 5 days earlier. Fight on, attack, under no condition surrender. King had read that order, he understood it, and he decided to disobey it. He sent 2 officers forward under a white flag to meet the Japanese. Then he put on his last clean uniform, because he believed a man should look like a soldier when he surrendered, and went to meet General Homma's representatives. He did not bring his sword, because he didn't want to give them the ceremony of receiving it. King surrendered approximately 76,000 American and Filipino troops. It was the largest capitulation in the history of the United States military, larger than the Continental Army's losses at Charleston in 1780, larger than anything in the Civil War. Wainwright on Corregidor found out after the fact. He had not authorized it. He had not been consulted. King had deliberately cut him out of the decision because King knew that Wainwright, bound by MacArthur's orders, would have been forced to say no. And saying no would have meant sending 76,000 starving sick men into a counterattack against a fresh Japanese army with air superiority and armor. King chose disobedience to save lives. History has mostly judged him kindly for it. But at the time, it was an act that could have put him in front of a court-martial. He knew that when he walked out with the white flag. What came next was something the men on Corregidor could hear about but couldn't stop: the Bataan Death March. From the southern tip of Bataan to the town of San Fernando, approximately 65 miles north, the prisoners were forced to walk. Some were trucked part of the way. Most were not. The march took between 5 and 12 days depending on where a man started and how fast he could keep moving. The heat was brutal Philippine tropical heat in April, over 100 degrees on the open road. There was almost no water. Guards bayoneted men who fell. Others were beaten with rifle butts for slowing down shot, for stepping out of line to drink from a ditch, or simply murdered for no reason anyone could identify. Stragglers were run over by Japanese trucks. Men who couldn't walk were left where they dropped. Some were buried alive by the side of the road. The exact death toll has never been established with certainty. Estimates range from 5,000 to over 10,000 dead on the march itself, with thousands more dying in the weeks after arrival at Camp O'Donnell, the overcrowded, disease-ridden prison compound that waited at the end. On Corregidor, 3.5 miles across the water, Wainwright received fragmentary reports. He couldn't see the march. He couldn't hear the individual shots. But he knew. And he could do nothing except stand on the tunnel's entrance, look across the channel toward Bataan, and understand that those were his men dying over there. Men he'd led in the retreat from Lingayen, men he'd eaten horse meat with in January, men who had trusted that someone somewhere was going to come and get them out. No one came. After Bataan fell, the Japanese turned everything they had toward Corregidor. Artillery bombardment began almost immediately, and it was methodical, relentless, and devastating. Homma positioned his guns on the Bataan shore 3 miles across the North Channel and on the Cavite shore to the south. 9 240mm howitzers, 34 149mm howitzers, 32 additional artillery pieces of various calibers. Day and night shells rained onto an island that was 3.5 miles long and less than a mile wide. The numbers were staggering. Japanese aircraft flew 614 bombing missions over Corregidor between late December and early May, dropping 1,701 bombs totaling 365 tons of explosives. But it was the artillery that truly broke the island. One day's shelling, defenders would later say, inflicted more damage than all the air raids combined. On May 4, 1942, the bombardment reached its peak. More than 16,000 shells hit Corregidor in a single day. 16,000. On an island you could walk across in 20 minutes. The Corregidor that American soldiers had known in peacetime, the broad lawns, the officers' club, the parade ground, shaded by acacia trees. The golf course, the swimming pool was gone. Every exposed structure on the surface had been destroyed. Trees were stripped to bare trunks. The ground was cratered so heavily it looked like a moonscape. Wainwright's men lived underground in Malinta tunnel. Inside there was a hospital, a communication center, supply rooms, a small power plant, and the headquarters from which Wainwright tried to command a defense that everyone knew was ending. The laterals were packed with wounded men. The air was thick with the smell of infected wounds and unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke from near misses that sent dust and debris pouring down the ventilation shafts. The lights flickered with every explosion. When a shell hit close enough, the entire tunnel shuddered, wall, ceiling, floor, and chunks of concrete broke loose and fell on the men lying below. After the fall of Bataan, Wainwright prohibited counter-battery fire for 3 days. His reason was agonizing. He feared there were wounded American and Filipino prisoners still on the Bataan shore, in the path of any shells his guns might fire in return. So for 3 days, Corregidor simply absorbed the punishment without shooting back. The men in the tunnels listened to the impacts and said nothing. Food was down to about 30 ounces per day, roughly 850 grams per man. Drinking water was distributed twice a day when the pipes were working, which was less and less often, because the shelling kept destroying the water mains, and the repair crews kept getting killed trying to fix them. Kitchens above ground were hit so repeatedly that cooking became impossible during daylight. Meals were prepared in darkness and distributed catch as catch can. Wainwright went up to the surface every day. His staff told him not to. They told him the same thing they told him on Bataan, that a lieutenant general had no business standing in the open under artillery fire, that he was too valuable to risk, that command decisions needed to be made from inside the tunnel. Wainwright listened. Then he went topside anyway, walking the defensive positions, checking on the gun crews, letting the men see that the commanding general was still there, still standing, still taking the same shelling they were. His staff urged him again to evacuate the same route MacArthur had taken. PT boat to Mindanao, plane to Australia. Wainwright refused. The choice had already been made weeks ago in his diary. He wasn't leaving. By the end of April, Corregidor was dying. The island's North Shore batteries, the heavy guns designed to stop a naval assault, were all knocked out by April 14th. On April 24th, Battery Crockett's guns took a direct hit. On May 2nd, Battery Geary 8 mortars in reinforced concrete emplacements was obliterated. One of the mortars was blown 150 yards from its mount and found on the island's cratered golf course. Another was driven through 3 feet of reinforced concrete into an adjacent powder magazine. The water supply was down to 4 days. The power plant was failing. The hospital laterals in Malinta tunnel were so packed with wounded that men lay shoulder to shoulder in the corridors. The doctors had run out of most medications. Gangrene cases were rising because there wasn't enough surgical capacity to keep up with the shrapnel wounds coming in every hour. Shortly before midnight on May 5th, Japanese forces launched their assault on Corregidor. Approximately 790 soldiers of the Japanese 4th Division boarded barges and landing craft and headed across the North Channel under cover of the heaviest artillery bombardment of the entire campaign. They landed on the tail of the island, the narrow eastern end, and immediately ran into fierce resistance. The defenders, despite everything, fought hard. Marine soldiers, sailors, Filipino scouts, everyone who could hold a rifle was on the line. The initial Japanese landing force took heavy casualties. Some barges were sunk by Corregidor's remaining beach defense guns before they reached shore. But the Japanese kept coming. More boats, more men. By dawn on May 6th, they had secured a beachhead and were pushing toward Malinta Hill. They brought tanks ashore. The defenders, out of anti-tank weapons, tried to stop them with small arms fire and improvised obstacles. It wasn't enough. By mid-morning, Japanese forces were approaching the eastern entrance of Malinta Tunnel. Inside were roughly 11,000 people. Soldiers, marine sailors, nurses, wounded civilians. If the Japanese reached the tunnel entrance and the fighting continued, it would be a massacre. Hand-to-hand combat in a confined space packed with 1,000 wounded men and the last of the nursing staff. Wainwright faced the decision he had known was coming for weeks. He could obey MacArthur's order from April 4th, fight on attack, under no condition surrender. That order was still standing. MacArthur had never rescinded it. Or he could surrender and save the people in that tunnel. At around noon on May 6th, Wainwright sent 2 officers forward with a white flag. He radioed the Japanese commander that he was prepared to capitulate. Then came the twist that turned a military surrender into something far worse. Wainwright was brought to the mainland to a small frame house on the Bataan shore. He waited in the stifling heat. Then 3 Japanese staff cars pulled up in a cloud of dust, and General Homma stepped out. The contrast between the 2 men was immediate and visual. Homma was barrel-chested, well-fed, in a clean-pressed uniform. Wainwright was hollow-cheeked, gaunt, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost more weight than he could afford to lose. They sat on opposite sides of a table on the veranda. There were no pleasantries. Wainwright tried the only card he had left. He offered to surrender Corregidor and the harbor fort's roughly 11,000 troops, just the forces directly under his immediate command. Homma said no. He wanted all of the Philippines, every American and Filipino soldier in the islands, including the roughly 20,000 troops under Brigadier General William Sharp in Mindanao, and the Visayas forces that were still fighting forces that Wainwright had tried to place outside his own chain of command, precisely so that this moment couldn't happen. Wainwright argued. He told Homma that he had no authority over Sharp's forces. This was the arrangement MacArthur had put in place before leaving the split command structure designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Homma didn't care. He told Wainwright the terms were unconditional surrender of all forces in the Philippines, or the fighting would continue. His artillery would resume. His infantry would push into Malinta tunnel. And whatever happened next to the people inside would be Wainwright's responsibility. Wainwright looked at the situation. 11,000 people in the tunnel, 1,000 of them wounded. No water in 4 days. No ammunition worth counting. No reinforcements coming, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He gave in. On the afternoon of May 6, 1942, Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright broadcast a radio message ordering all United States forces in the Philippines to cease resistance and surrender to the Japanese. His voice, according to those who heard the broadcast, broke during the transmission. He sent a final message to President Roosevelt. "There is a limit of human endurance," he said, "and that point has long been passed." It was the largest surrender in the history of the United States military. In Australia, MacArthur received the news and reacted with fury. He cabled the War Department in Washington that he believed Wainwright had become temporarily unbalanced. He ordered Wainwright's subordinates in the southern Philippines to disregard the surrender order and continue fighting. Some did for a time. Sharp in Mindanao held out for several more days before concluding that the Japanese would execute the Corregidor prisoners if he didn't comply. He surrendered his forces on May 10th. Scattered units across the islands took to the hills and became guerrillas. But organized American resistance in the Philippines was finished. MacArthur's reaction didn't stop at the initial cable. When George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, the man who had recommended MacArthur's own Medal of Honor just 2 months earlier, proposed on July 30th, 1942, that Wainwright also be awarded the Medal of Honor, MacArthur fired back. He called the proposed citation inaccurate, arguing that other generals had shown far greater leadership than Wainwright. He never named which generals he meant. Marshall and Stimson disagreed with MacArthur, but neither man wanted an open fight in the middle of a war. So the Medal of Honor nomination was quietly put in a drawer. Not rejected, not approved, just waiting. Wainwright, of course, knew nothing about any of this. By the time MacArthur was writing angry cables about medals, Wainwright was already in a prisoner of war camp, trying to stay alive on rice and water. The Japanese moved Wainwright through a series of camps over the next 3.5 years, each one more remote than the last. First, the Philippines camps on Luzon, where the conditions were brutal even for officers of his rank. The Japanese did not observe the distinction between enlisted men and generals when it came to hunger. Wainwright ate what everyone ate: rice, water, whatever scraps could be found. He was paraded before cameras for propaganda purposes, the conquered American general proof of Japan's supremacy. Then Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, the camp at Carenco on the island's eastern coast. Farther from the Philippines, farther from any possibility of rescue. The guards were harsher, the isolation deeper. Finally, Manchuria, a camp near Mukden, modern-day Shenyang in northeastern China. It was bitterly cold in winter, a different kind of suffering from the tropical heat of the Philippines. The camp held a small collection of high-ranking Allied officers captured across Southeast Asia. Among them was Lieutenant General Arthur Percival of the British Army, the man who had surrendered Singapore on February 15, 1942, with approximately 80,000 troops, the largest capitulation in British military history. 2 generals, 2 surrenders, 2 empires humbled, locked in the same frozen camp in a corner of China that the rest of the world had almost forgotten about. The Japanese subjected Wainwright to what he would later describe as systematic starvation. He was beaten. He was humiliated. He was kept alive barely because a living American general was more useful for propaganda than a dead one. Whatever was left of the man who had ridden horses across Luzon was being consumed pound by pound, winter by winter. But the worst part wasn't physical. It was the question that never left him. The one that sat in his chest like a stone every morning when he woke up in whatever frozen barracks the Japanese had put him in. Would America call him a coward? He lived with that question for 1,267 days. In August 1945, the war ended twice. First on the 6th, a single bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then on the 9th, another fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio the first time most of them had ever heard his voice, and told them that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the most understated announcement of unconditional surrender in human history. In a frozen camp in Manchuria, the guards disappeared first. One morning they were there. The next morning they weren't. The prisoners, gone confused, unsure whether this was a trick, waited. Then Soviet tanks appeared on the road outside the wire. The Red Army, which had declared war on Japan only days earlier, was rolling through Manchuria like a wave, and the prisoner of war camps were in its path. Wainwright was freed sometime around August 23rd or 24th. The exact date varies by a day depending on the source. Two agents from the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor of the CIA, were the first Americans to reach him. They secured his release from the Soviet forces who had overrun the camp. It had been 3 years. 3 months and 18 days since he had surrendered Corregidor. The man the OSS agents found barely resembled the general who had walked out under a white flag in May of 1942. Wainwright's hair was completely white. His skin was cracked and papery, stretched over a skeleton that had lost so much weight, his cheekbones looked like they might cut through from the inside. His uniform, such as it was, hung on him like it belonged to someone else. He was 62 years old and looked 80, but he was standing. The first thing Wainwright asked the Americans who found him was not about the war, not about Japan's surrender, not about his family or his country or what had happened in the 3.5 years since the world had gone dark around him. He asked whether he was going to be court-martialed. The OSS men told him the truth, or what they knew of it. They told him he was a hero, that Americans had followed his story, that the public considered him a symbol of courage, not a symbol of defeat. Wainwright didn't believe them. He had spent over 1,000 days building a wall of certainty inside his own mind. Certainty that he would be judged, found wanting, punished. That wall didn't come down because 2 young intelligence officers in a Manchurian camp said otherwise. It would take more than words. It would take proof. The proof came in stages, each one a little more overwhelming than the last. On August 31st, 1945, Wainwright arrived in Yokohama, Japan. MacArthur was waiting for him at the new Grand Hotel. MacArthur had not seen Wainwright since March of 1942, since the night the PT boat slipped out of Corregidor's harbor and carried MacArthur to Mindanao, to Australia, to a Medal of Honor, to Supreme Command of the Southwest Pacific, to the liberation of the Philippines, and finally to Tokyo Bay as the most powerful American general in the Pacific. When MacArthur saw Wainwright walk into the hotel, he was stunned. The man in front of him was barely recognizable. The skinny of 1942, already thin, already drawn, had become something else entirely. A living ghost. The physical cost of 3.5 years of systematic starvation and captivity was written on every line of Wainwright's face, in the way his hands trembled slightly, in the way his eyes moved with the wariness of a man who had spent too long waiting to be hit. MacArthur embraced him. Whatever MacArthur had said in 1942, the cable calling Wainwright temporarily unbalanced. The furious objections to his Medal of Honor. The order to fight to the end that Wainwright had been unable to carry out, none of it was spoken aloud in that hotel lobby. MacArthur was many things. He was vain, controlling, brilliant, infuriating, and relentlessly conscious of his own place in history. But he was also a man who understood moments. And this moment, the return of the general he had left behind, required generosity. Whether that generosity was genuine or calculated, or some combination of both that only Douglas MacArthur himself could have untangled, is a question that history has never fully settled. What MacArthur did next, though, was unambiguous. He told Wainwright that he would stand directly behind him during the formal surrender ceremony, the most visible position, right in the frame of every camera that would capture the moment Japan signed away its empire. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. A gray overcast morning. The sky hung low over the water like a ceiling. The battleship USS Missouri sat at anchor, her decks crowded with officers from every allied nation. American, British, Australian, Chinese, Soviet, French, Dutch, New Zealand, Canadian. Hundreds of men in dress uniforms pressed and polished the victors of a war that had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. On a nearby bulkhead hung a fragile, faded American flag bearing 31 stars, the flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had flown from his flagship when he sailed into this same bay in 1853 to force Japan open to the Western world. 92 years later, in the same waters, the empire that Perry's arrival had set in motion was signing its own death certificate. The Japanese delegation arrived at 9 o'clock, 11 men in formal morning coats and top hats, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who limped on a wooden leg he'd received after a Korean independence activist threw a bomb at him in 1932. They stood in a tight group surrounded by the stares of every Allied officer on the ship and waited. MacArthur stepped to the microphone. He spoke briefly about freedom, about tolerance, about the hope that a better world would emerge from the destruction. His words were measured, almost serene, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for 3.5 years. Then the signing began. Shigemitsu sat down first and signed for the emperor and the Japanese government. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for the Imperial General Staff. Then it was MacArthur's turn. He used several pens to sign the document. This was deliberate. MacArthur understood that the pens used to sign Japan's surrender would become historical artifacts, objects that would be kept in museums, displayed in libraries, passed down through families. He signed with one pen, then switched to another, then another. One of those pens he gave to Jonathan Wainwright, who was standing directly behind him. Thin white head wearing a uniform that no tailor could make fit a body that had shrunk this much. Another pen he gave to Arthur Percival, the British general who had surrendered Singapore, who had spent the same 3.5 years in the same camps, who had arrived on the Missouri looking just as hollowed out as Wainwright. Two generals, two surrenders, two men who had carried the weight of the largest capitulations in their nation's histories for over 1,000 days, standing in the most visible spot on the most photographed ship in the world, on the most consequential morning of the 20th century, watching the men who had imprisoned them sign away everything. The photograph from that moment is one of the most powerful images of the entire Second World War, not because of what it shows on the surface, but because of what you have to know to understand it. You have to know what those two thin men had been through. You have to know what it cost them to be standing there at all. 8 days later, Wainwright stood in the Rose Garden of the White House. President Harry Truman, who had been a senator when Wainwright surrendered Corregidor, who had become president only 5 months earlier, after Roosevelt's death, stepped up to a bank of microphones and read a citation. It spoke of intrepid and determined leadership against greatly superior enemy forces, of the repeated risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, of the final stand on beleaguered Corregidor that had commanded the admiration of the nation's allies. When Truman finished reading, he placed the Medal of Honor around Wainwright's neck. Wainwright had not known it was coming. He had been invited to the White House for what he thought was a reception. The ceremony was, in a sense, an ambush, the kindest ambush in military history. The medal that MacArthur had tried to block. The medal that Marshall had proposed in July of 1942. The medal that MacArthur had called an injustice. Secretary of War Stimson had reviewed MacArthur's objections one final time before approving the award. His conclusion, recorded in official correspondence, was blunt. MacArthur's arguments were, in Stimson's words, untenable and, on their face, untrue. Truman hadn't needed much convincing. He had his own views about MacArthur that would become considerably more public during the Korean War. Wainwright wore the Medal of Honor for the rest of his life. 3 days after the Rose Garden ceremony on September 13, 1945, New York City gave Wainwright a ticker tape parade. He rode up Broadway in an open car past the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, through a blizzard of paper thrown from office windows by people who had spent 3.5 years reading about him in newspapers, first as the general who was holding on then, as the general who had surrendered, then as the general who had disappeared into Japanese captivity, and now as the general who had come home. The sidewalks were packed. The paper fell like snow. Wainwright, sitting in the back of the car, looked out at the crowds with the expression of a man who still wasn't entirely certain this was happening to him. He had entered captivity believing he would be court-martialed. He came home to a parade. The years after the war were quieter and shorter than they should have been. Wainwright was promoted to full general 4 stars. He took command of the 4th Army at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, and served until his retirement in 1947 after 41 years of military service. He signed a book deal worth $155,000, an enormous sum, in 1945, and his memoir, General Wainwright's Story Porter, was published by Doubleday in 1946. It became a bestseller. The book was edited by Robert Considine, and it told the story straight, without self-pity and without excuses. Wainwright recounted the retreat, the starvation, the surrender, and the years in captivity with the same plainness that had defined him as an officer. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not claim to be a hero. He described what happened, and he let the reader decide. He never publicly criticized MacArthur, not once. Not in the book, not in interviews, not in private correspondence that has since been made available to historians. For the rest of his life, Wainwright bore no grudge and expressed no malice toward the man who had left him behind. Whether this restraint came from genuine grace or from the discipline of a career officer who had been trained never to speak against a superior, or from the exhaustion of a man who had simply suffered enough, that's something only Wainwright knew. He never explained it. What he did not know, what he could not have known because the relevant cables and correspondence weren't made public until years after his death, was the full extent of MacArthur's opposition. He didn't know about the temporarily unbalanced cable. He didn't know the specific language MacArthur had used to argue against his Medal of Honor. He didn't know that Stimson had called MacArthur's objections untrue. He went to his grave not knowing how hard one man had worked to deny him the recognition that another man had fought to give him. The fates of the 3 central figures in this story ended at very different points in very different ways. Masaharu Homma, the Japanese general who had demanded Wainwright's unconditional surrender on that veranda in Bataan, was arrested after the war and charged with war crimes. His trial was held in Manila from January 3rd to February 11th, 1946, before a military commission of 5 generals handpicked by Douglas MacArthur. The charge was command responsibility, that Homma, as the commanding officer of Japanese forces in the Philippines, was accountable for the atrocities committed during the Bataan Death March, whether or not he had personally ordered them. Homma's defense was that he hadn't known the full extent of what was happening, that he had been focused on planning the Corregidor assault and had delegated prisoner logistics to subordinates, that when he did learn of the conditions, he had the camp commander removed. The commission convicted him. The legal principle was clear. A commanding officer is responsible for the actions of his troops, whether he knew about those actions or not. Associate Justice Frank Murphy of the United States Supreme Court dissented when the court declined to review the case. The trial, Murphy argued, had descended to the level of revengeful blood purges. On April 3, 1946, Masaharu Homma was executed by firing squad at Los Baños, Laguna in the Philippines. He was calm. He was tied to a post and hooded. The volley came before dawn. History has been less certain about his guilt than the commission was. MacArthur went on. He oversaw the occupation of Japan, reshaping the country's government, economy, and constitution with the authority of a viceroy. He commanded United Nations forces during the Korean War, until Truman fired him in April 1951 for publicly contradicting the president's policy. He came home to his own ticker-tape parade, the largest in New York City's history, and delivered a farewell address to Congress that ended with the line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." He died on April 5, 1964, at the age of 84, and was buried in Norfolk, Virginia. He remains one of the most decorated, most controversial, and most studied generals in American history. Wainwright faded more quietly. His health never fully recovered from the years of captivity. The systematic starvation, the beatings, the cold of Manchurian winters, the psychological weight of 3.5 years spent believing he would be disgraced. All of it left marks that didn't heal. He retired to San Antonio, lived modestly, attended reunions when his health allowed, and kept in touch with the men who had served with him on Bataan and Corregidor, the ones who had survived. On September 2nd, 1953, exactly 8 years to the day after the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri, the morning he had stood behind MacArthur with a pen in his hand and watched Japan sign away its war. Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright IV died of a stroke at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas. He was 70 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 1, among the generals and the presidents, and the men who had shaped the country he had served for 41 years. There is a photograph that sits in the National Archives, one of thousands taken on the deck of the Missouri that September morning in 1945. In it, MacArthur is seated at the table, pen in hand, signing the instrument that ended the war. Behind him, slightly to the left, stands Wainwright. Behind him, slightly to the right, stands Percival. MacArthur is the center of the frame. He always was. That was his gift and his flaw and his genius, the ability to place himself at the center of every story he inhabited. But if you look past MacArthur, past the brass and the ceremony and the flags, your eye eventually finds Wainwright, the thin man, the one in the loose uniform, the one who didn't leave. He wasn't a perfect general. His defense of the Philippines didn't succeed. It was never going to succeed. He didn't win a single campaign. He didn't turn the tide of any battle. His most consequential military decision was the decision to stop fighting, but he stayed. When he was told to leave, he stayed. When his men were starving, he starved with them. When the shells were falling, he walked out into them. When the only choice left was between watching his men die for nothing and surrendering them to an enemy he knew would not treat them well, he chose the option that kept them breathing and accepted that he might pay for it with his reputation, his career, and his freedom. And then he sat in a prison camp for 3.5 years waiting to be punished for doing the right thing. Jonathan Wainwright didn't choose to be a hero. He chose to be present. He chose to stay in the room when the room was on fire, and to be the last man out and to carry whatever judgment came with that. The heroism, if that's what it was, wasn't in a single act of battlefield courage. It was in the accumulation of days, day after day after day, of choosing not to leave, not to look away, not to put himself first. He was the man who was left behind, and he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stood his ground.